Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to this live webcast from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I'm Drew Thompson. I'm a senior visiting research fellow here at the school, and this is the second of a four-part series that celebrates 55 years of diplomatic relations between the United States and Singapore. This series is jointly organized by the Lee Kuan Yew School and the U.S. Embassy of Singapore. For 55 years, the U.S. and Singapore have forged an affirmative and enduring beneficial relationship based on robust security and defense cooperation, mutual economic interests, and extensive people-to-people ties. The U.S. and Singapore are close partners who consistently work together in support of a rules-based economic and security order in the Asia-Pacific. Our two countries work together across a wide spectrum of issues in the law enforcement and the military domains, addressing diverse security issues including terrorism, transnational crime, counterproliferation, as well as defense cooperation. And through this deep partnership, which rests on long-standing defense and security agreements, the bilateral relationship has contributed to the security and prosperity of both countries, as well as stability for the region as well. We've assembled here a great panel to discuss the U.S.-Singapore security cooperation, and in a moment, I'll introduce each of them and ask them to make opening remarks. Following their remarks, we'll have a discussion enabling us to dive a bit deeper into the points that they've raised. I would like to invite our audience on Facebook to please submit their questions to this live feed with their comments, and we'll draw on those questions during the discussion which I'll present to the panel. Please feel free to submit your comments throughout the event as the speakers are talking so that I can incorporate them into the Q&A session. There's no reason to wait until after they've spoken. So now I'll briefly introduce each of the speakers. Their bios, their complete bios, are available on the school's webpage, which is announcing this event. Our first speaker will be Ms. Dawn Barito. She's the Regional Attaché, U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security Investigations, Department of Homeland Security, based here in the U.S. Embassy in Singapore. Prior to her posting in Singapore, she was the Homeland Security Investigations Deputy Special Agent in charge in Los Angeles. Here in Singapore, it's worth noting that she's responsible for overseeing the HSI offices in Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Our second speaker is Colonel Sebastian Chai. He's the Director International Defense Policy Office in the Ministry of Defense here in Singapore. Colonel Chai serves in the Singapore Air Force, and he's an F-16 pilot. He graduated from the U.S. Air Force Command and Staff College in 2018 with a master's in military operational art and science. And he was also the commanding officer of the 145 Squadron here in Singapore, known as the Hornets. Captain Ray Owens, he's the senior defense official, defense and naval attaché based in the U.S. Embassy here. Captain Owens graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1996, and he is a P-3C Orion pilot. His previous posting was as naval attaché in India. And our final speaker will be Mr. Nicholas Fung. He is the Director, Security and Global Affairs at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, Singapore's oldest and most distinguished think tank. He's also the Managing Director of Black Dot Research and a former journalist for both the Straits Times and Channel News Asia. And as we watch the Olympics, we should note that he was also formerly a four-time national champion in fencing for Singapore. So he's not only brilliant, he's also lethal. So with that, I'll ask each of the speakers to make their introductory remarks, followed by Q&A, and then we'll have a wrap-up session at the very end. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dawn.
Thank you, Drew. Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for the invitation to participate in today's discussion celebrating 55 years of diplomatic relations between the United States and Singapore, highlighting key partnerships in the security sector. I also would like to recognize and thank Drew Thompson and my colleagues from the defense sector, Mr. Fang, Colonel Chai, and Captain Owens. On the heels of Secretary Austin's visit, it's apparent that the U.S. and Singapore share a robust bilateral partnership. Another key partnership that is not often discussed is the bilateral cooperation of law enforcement components. The U.S. Embassy in Singapore is home to 8 U.S. federal law enforcement agencies with varying missions that oftentimes intersect. Noteworthy areas of collaboration with Singapore law enforcement include counterproliferation, trade enforcement, intellectual property rights, cybercrime, counterterrorism, border security, and child exploitation. Over the course of the last 55 years, the law enforcement agencies have developed strong relationships that have resulted in bilateral agreements. The most notable is the Law Enforcement, Homeland Security, and Safety Cooperation Dialogue. Following an April 2013 meeting between President Obama and Prime Minister Lee, where both agreed to explore the deepening of non-military security cooperation. The United States and Singapore agreed to establish a senior-level dialogue to further strengthen the law enforcement and homeland security strategic and enduring collaboration and coordination between our two countries. During the first high-level officials meeting held in December 2013, representatives from the U.S. Embassy and Ministry of Home Affairs discussed agency-to-agency, or rather police-to-police cooperation outside of any binding international agreement, and acknowledged that such cooperation would be guided by, among others, the following general principles and considerations: respect for the sovereignty of other nations, respect for national laws, national interests, reciprocity, and the spirit of openness and cooperation. In 2014, the first Law Enforcement Homeland Security Safety Cooperation Dialogue senior officials meeting convened. The dialogue was built upon bilateral law enforcement relationships through targeted discussions by senior officials from the Ministry of Home Affairs, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The LEHSSC is divided into 6 pillars: cybercrimes, commercial crime, current and emerging trends, border security, illicit trade enforcement, and training and capacity building. As a result of the high official meeting, and 10 years after the U.S.-Singapore Free Trade Agreement was signed, the governments negotiated a Customs Mutual Assistance Agreement that was signed in the fall of 2014. The CMAA allows Homeland Security Investigations, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and Singapore Customs the ability to share customs information without the need to submit a formal legal request. This sharing of information enables law enforcement to act swiftly to prevent the illegal flow of contraband destined to transnational criminal organizations who pose threats to both our country's national security and financial infrastructure. This year will mark the 14th annual U.S.-Singapore Counterproliferation Dialogue. As a result of the Counterproliferation Dialogue in 2018, Homeland Security Investigations led the U.S. interagency in the inaugural Counterproliferations tabletop exercise with Singapore Customs and other key stakeholders. The tabletop exercise provides invaluable opportunities for government officials from the U.S. and Singapore to come together to share sensitive information and best practices, identify capability gaps and/or stumbling blocks, and build relationships and collectively develop meaningful solutions addressing everyone's equities and to set goals for the year ahead. As digital globalization continues to press forward, it is paramount that law enforcement agencies not only collaborate and share intelligence, but also build strong public-private partnerships to ensure that we address vulnerabilities in the digital space that considerably impact our supply chain security. This is accomplished through a whole-of-government approach and our multilateral cooperation, the Asia-Pacific region. I would like to illuminate that our partnerships and investigative efforts have resulted in the prevention of millions of dollars in lost victim funds from financial fraud scams, the taking down and seizure of fraudulent e-commerce sites, the arrest of child sexual abusers, the seizures of counterfeit personal protective equipment and pharmaceutical therapies, and have prevented the military supply chain from inadvertently sourcing compromised integrated circuits. These successes help keep our nations and our citizens safe. The U.S. Embassy and our Singapore colleagues come together to support ASEAN countries in the region through third country training programs. Some key topics include commercial fraud, intellectual property rights, cybersecurity, financial fraud, and wildlife trafficking. This training further illustrates the commitment of both countries to support the multilateral collaboration and capacity in the region. I would like to thank you all again for having me today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dawn. Sebastian?
Yeah, hi everybody, I'm Sebastian. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and join in this discussion today. And thank you very much, Drew, for the introduction as well. And good evening, everyone on Facebook. I've structured my opening remarks into 3 parts. First part is how did we get here? Second part is how well are we doing here? And the third part is where do we go from here? First, let me start off with how did we get here? The Singapore-US defense relationship is a key pillar of our overall bilateral relation with the US. This is based on our shared belief that the US presence in the region has been vital for peace, stability, and prosperity. Defense ties really started to take off in 1990 when then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and then US Vice President Dan Quayle signed the seminal document, the 1990 Memorandum of Understanding regarding US use of facilities in Singapore. It allowed the US Armed Forces use of our facilities and provided transit and logistic support for US aircraft and vessels at a time when the US had lost access to other bases in the region. Since then, we strengthened our defense ties. In 2005, we signed the Strategic Framework Agreement, which recognized Singapore as a major security cooperation partner. In 2015, we signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which affirmed a shared commitment to deepening cooperation beyond traditional domains. Just 2 years ago, in 2019, our leaders signed the Protocol of Amendment to renew the 1990 MOU by another 15 years. Second, how well are we doing here? Today, the bilateral defense relationship is deep and multifaceted. We have strong relations at the political and senior leadership levels. Just this month alone, MINDEF SCF hosted 4 high-level US visitors: Secretary of Defense, Chief of Naval Operations, Commander Indo-PACOM, and Commander Pat Fleet. So the timing of this session really couldn't have been any better. On the military side, we appreciate the US consistent support for the SCF training detachments and exercises in the US, which enable us to overcome our constraints of limited land area and airspace as a small island state. We have 3 training detachments in the US: the F-16 in Luke Air Force Base, the F-15s in Mountain Home Air Force Base, and the AH-64s in Arizona. Our services also exercise together regularly to enhance cooperation and mutual understanding between the 2 militaries and deepen personal and professional ties between our personnel. For example, our armies recently took part in the 40th edition of Exercise Tiger Balm. Our navies just completed the 3rd edition of Exercise Pacific Griffin off the waters of Guam earlier this month. Our air forces also have Exercise Commando Sling, which is a bilateral exercise for fighter aircraft, which has been running for close to 30 years. In terms of operations, we support each other as well. Singapore has contributed assets and people to support the Defeat ISIS coalition in the Middle East and anti-piracy efforts in the Gulf of Aden. In this region, the US has supported our regional maritime security efforts at the Information Fusion Center and counter-terrorism efforts at the Counter-Terrorism Information Facility. Third, where do we go from here? Our defense relations will only continue to grow from strength to strength. We have many exciting initiatives to look forward to. During Secretary Austin's visit to Singapore, both the Secretary and my Minister of Defense, Dr. Ng Eng Hen, issued a joint statement where they expressed hope for further cooperation, including in areas such as cyber defense, strategic communications, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Looking further ahead, we will also be receiving our F-35 Bravos by 2026, and we will be standing up a new fighter training detachment in Guam by 2029. We look forward to deepening an already strong and mutually beneficial defense relationship. Thank you, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion later.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Ray?
Good evening. My name is Captain Ray Owens. I'm the Defense Attaché at the U.S. Embassy here in Singapore. And I've been here just about a year in Singapore and enough time to become good friends with Sebastian here. And so you'll see from my comments, they pretty much echo everything he just said. So we work daily together to advance our bilateral defense relationship. And as he mentioned, it's been a very busy month for the both of us as we had the PAC Fleet Commander, Indo-PACOM Commander, and then just today we said goodbye to our Chief of Naval Operations as he flew out from Paya Lebar. And yesterday we saw the Secretary of Defense Austin visit. And these visits demonstrate the priority that the U.S. places on the bilateral relationship with Singapore and on the U.S. presence in the region. This presence has been consistent and constant over many decades. With the signing of the MOU for U.S. use of facilities in Singapore in 1990 and several subsequent agreements that Sebastian went into detail on, Singapore has been a primary enabler of this presence over the past 30 years. And then this MOU being renewed in 2019 for another 15 years signals the commitment of both our countries to continued growth in the defense relationship. Concurrent with this MOU, Singapore has conducted training at facilities in the U.S. with the first training detachment established in 1988. However, our defense relationship is far more than just the benefits we both gain from mutual access. It's underpinned by our alignment and support for the international rules-based order and the rule of law. Singapore has been at the forefront in shaping this international system, as evidenced by the leading role Singapore played in the development of UNCLOS. I'd like to highlight a few lines of effort that demonstrate how we operationalize this strategic alignment, along with a few of my own personal experiences. The first aspect I'll highlight is training. Training institutionalizes our people-to-people relationship, it aligns our processes, and enables us to coordinate seamlessly when requirements arise. We conduct a multitude of training exchanges at joint and service schools in both the U.S. and Singapore. We also have midshipmen and cadets from Singapore at our U.S. service academies. For me personally, my first introduction to Singapore was on day one at the Naval Academy, when a midshipman from Singapore indoctrinated me into the U.S. Navy. Second aspect, I'll highlight our exercises. Our exercises serve to strengthen our linkages and contribute to the readiness of both our country's forces. We hold exercises across all services: Tiger Balm for the Army, Commando Sling for the Air Force, Valiant Mark with the Marine Corps, and Carrot and Pacific Griffin for the Navy. I'd also offer that for those U.S. service members lucky enough to exercise in Singapore, we're able to establish bonds, connections, and memories that are long-lasting. For me, I was first introduced to char kway teow, nasi lemak, and chicken rice at Hawker Centers 20 years ago during a carrot exercise in Singapore, and I've been hooked ever since. Third aspect is logistics cooperation. That's the support that Singapore provides truly anchors U.S. presence in the region. I first came to Singapore in the year 2000 on a refueling stop on a P-3 Orion. I then had multiple experiences over the years where Singapore provided critical logistics support, whether pulling in on the USS Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier or conducting multiple P-3 detachments. My experiences are just a small window into the support that Singapore has provided over the years, but they do provide an indicator of Singapore's long-term, sustained commitment to enabling U.S. presence in the region. The fourth item I'd like to highlight is operational coordination. The training and exercises that we regularly conduct enable seamless coordination for our forces when the need arises. I recall that in 2014, in the search for the Malaysian airliner MH370, Singapore and U.S. aircraft quickly joined the search effort. An RSAF C-130 was the first foreign aircraft to the search area, and a U.S. P-3 joined while en route from Japan. The P-3 checked on station with the RSAF C-130, handling on-scene commander duties. Although the crews had never worked together previously, the institutional relationships between our forces enabled smooth coordination and the operation to be conducted in a safe and effective manner. This sort of cooperation demonstrates the effects of our mutual investments in training and exercises. Singapore has also contributed significantly to ensuring maritime security with deployments in support of and leading CTF-151 counter-piracy efforts in the Gulf of Aden. The RSAF has also deployed tanker aircraft to provide air-to-air refueling support for coalition aircraft. Further, Singapore has been a leader in developing multilateral cooperation mechanisms to address shared threats. Singapore established the Maritime-Focused Information Fusion Center in 2009, and this center has established connectivity throughout the region and provided the model for others to follow. More recently, Singapore's establishment of the Counterterrorism Information Facility will broaden cooperation to counter terrorist threats. While not involving the US, Singapore's proposals to establish an ADMM Cyber and Information Center of Excellence will foster cooperation to address threats that all in the region face. These fusion centers offer the ability to leverage partner capabilities and have broadly served to increase the security of the region. The cooperation I described is by no means comprehensive and just offers a sampling of the ways that the US and Singapore defense relationship advances security and prosperity in the region. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ray. Nicholas.
Thanks very much, Drew. Good evening, everyone, and thank you as well to the LKUI School of Public Policy for having me here as part of this illustrious panel. And I think the insights that have been shared so far are illuminating. I'll try to share some remarks, potentially not specifically from a defense perspective, but also then moving into addressing some of the security concerns that affect both the US and Singapore. I think the earlier speakers have given us a lot of context in terms of the very close relationship between Singapore and the US. I'd just like to highlight a couple of factors that haven't been touched on so far. I think the US and Singapore's long and very fruitful relationship is known by everyone. But it's interesting to note that the first free trade agreement that the US signed with any Asian country was with Singapore in 2004. The US is Singapore's largest foreign direct investor with in the region of about 180 billion US dollars each year coming into Singapore from US businesses. Singapore has also been highlighted as a major security cooperation partner of the US. If we use the language in the FY 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, and that signals again the kind of cooperation and close relationship that the two countries have had for many, many years. I think another fact that is known, but potentially not that well known, is that Changi Naval Base in Singapore is also one of the few facilities in the world that can actually accommodate a US aircraft carrier. We've spoken quite often in the past as well of the littoral combat ships and the P-8 Poseidon aircraft that rotate in and out of Singapore on a fairly regularized basis as well. So without belaboring the point, Singapore and the US are very close partners, and I think look forward to a close relationship now and in the future. If I can turn a little bit to Singapore's security and defense priorities, I'd say that Singapore has always been driven by a strong sense of pragmatism. If we look at the broad national priorities, remaining a safe, stable, and secure environment for Singaporeans and for people residing in the country, ensuring an open and free trade environment both in the region and around the world, and also emphasizing a rules-based order in which all countries in the region and internationally are able to prosper and thrive in a safe and secure manner, are high on the list of what the Singapore government has always pointed to as key national objectives. There is a danger when we talk about defense and security concerns to be drawn into a great power rivalry narrative between the US and China most recently. I think all of us have heard the results of the recent Pew study that reflected Singaporeans, by and large, positive view of China, slightly different from the global average. I have to say that this is a danger that we have to guard against. The world, as seen through a Singapore lens, is not purely divided between the Singapore and the US, between China and the US. There are more issues that Singapore has to be concerned about as a small, open, and cosmopolitan country-state, city-state in this particular part of the world. The traditional security concerns of Singapore are predicated quite often on our immediate neighborhood, which can be challenging at times. And of course, major power rivalry in the region, maritime territorial concerns continue to be issues that we look very, very closely at. That being said, there is, of course, emerging threats that are not classified under conventional military or security challenges, and these include hybrid or non-conventional threats, terrorism, information operations, and as Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin also mentioned during his time in Singapore, the gray zone issues that he has described as an area that increased cooperation between Singapore and the US would be very welcome. In light of all this, an enduring relationship with the US is a critical priority for Singapore, as has been shared by our Defense Minister and many of our senior leaders over the years, and most recently this month as well. There is a hope from all of us in Singapore to see the US engaged and invested in the region, and this is both economically as well as strategically, and of course that encompasses in defense terms as well. As our leaders have said recently, an antagonistic and confrontational relationship between the US and China is not in anyone's interests. And Singapore will consistently look and is prepared to be a trusted partner to all parties. As has been said many, many times before, there is an extreme desire not to be forced to choose between any major power. Looking at the situation that's developed since last year, I think a lot of us in Singapore are very happy to see a return to a more normal sense of international diplomacy after an interesting 4 years leading up to the elections in the US in 2020. One of the things that we would, of course, like to see a little bit more progress on, we still don't have a US ambassador here in Singapore. I think that would be a very welcome move for us to see. And indeed, the Defense Secretary's visit to Singapore represented the first visit by a member of the current administration's cabinet to visit Southeast Asia. And it's very heartening to see that he has come to Singapore and is also continuing his visit within this particular region. I think if we consider the future and where we're heading to, I think Singapore will continue to seek to be a strong and trusted partner for the US in this region. Secretary of Defense Austin also mentioned that he was looking to establish stronger crisis communications with China, and I think that is an area in which Singapore could potentially play a role as an interlocutor and a trusted friend, as we did when we hosted the Trump-Kim summit back in 2018. And of course, as has been mentioned by the earlier speakers, and the other areas that we want to seek further collaboration in include cyber, artificial intelligence, strategic communications, as well as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. So many opportunities in which we can continue the very good work that has been done in the past few years to keep building what hopefully will remain a very strong and positive relationship for Singapore, for US, and indeed for the region. And I personally am looking forward to the next 55 years of this strong and positive relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So we have about 40 minutes for Q&A, and I'll lead a discussion between us. So I'll pose each of the panelists some questions just to get the discussion going. And I thought I would start with Dawn. I'm interested because, I mean, obviously it's difficult to compete with the US aircraft carrier calling into port, right? It's a big, visible, tangible demonstration of US power and presence and partnership. What you do is much more coordinating function. It's a little lower key, but I'm intrigued that you here in Singapore have regional responsibilities, and you're not only working and overseeing the offices in Malaysia and Indonesia, you're also working with various parts of both the US government and the Singapore government. So I'd be interested to get a little bit more information, sort of your insights into how is it that Singapore kind of plays this really central hub in what you do as a coordinating center, both within the US interagency, within Singapore's government, and then regionally? What's the kind of competitive advantage that you find being here?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Singapore is a financial and a trade hub, as we all know, and that's really key in the Asia-Pacific region for the United States. and for the offices that I cover both in Malaysia and Indonesia. And I think when we look at today's society, and I mentioned it in my opening remarks, cybersecurity, cyber investigations are key. And so because of our relationships with Singapore Police, Singapore Customs, HTX, which is their science and technology branch, we're able to really build robust relationships and interact with Interpol to develop programs and capacity building programs throughout the region. And as we keep moving forward in the 21st century and into the digital age, it's really important for us to be able to share those values, share that intelligence. The public-private partnership is key, and with the financial institutions being here, it's really an advantage for us because we're able to get our message out. Because many stakeholders don't know why U.S. law enforcement is here. And so we are able to share best practices, which become key, right? Because we all don't know what we don't know. And so when we have the type of relationships that we have with the police, we're able to share that information and we're able to deflect our adversaries, which essentially keeps not only our people safe, but our financial infrastructure and that of our government. And so we really leverage that to do training. And through the embassy, we work with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Safety Agency. And I know that they have a very good, robust relationship with Singapore. And we also work with the State Department, the International Law Enforcement Training Academies. And so that through those programs, we're able to get the word out to nations globally. The one that's in the region is in Bangkok. And so we host cyber trainings there.
And it's worth noting that the Department of Homeland Security is responsible and has a key role in cyber defense, right, for
Yes.
protecting government networks.
Yes.
Thank you. That was
Along with DOJ and FBI. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was very
Thank you.
interesting. I thought maybe I'll pose a question to both Ray and Sebastian because, as Ray pointed out, you both, probably without a lot of coordination, have very much the same story to tell. And I was intrigued how the intersection between your essentially military interoperability really affects your ability to cooperate and forms a basis. So maybe you could both tell me a little bit more about how your experience as operators, in both of your cases pilots, in your respective services for your respective countries, how does that shared and common experience as uniformed military officers who are experts in something other than diplomacy, how does that affect your essentially diplomatic roles?
Okay, maybe I'll take this question first, Drew, before you can add on. So I think the key really is, which I know Ray talked about it in his opening remarks as well, which I want to further echo and emphasize on is the people-to-people relationship that we've built since the start of our careers. So he shared a bit about his career. I'll share a bit more about mine as well. So for me, I'm an Air Force F-16 pilot by training. The US and Singapore both operate the F-16s. And since from a very young age in my career, I've been trained in the US. I did my first experience, I actually did my initial pilot training in the US in Texas. I spent 1.5 years in Texas. Then throughout the rest of my career, I've been going back to the US for various purposes. I mentioned earlier that we have F-16s in Luke Air Force Base. I was there for a while as well. When I was in a staff appointment back in headquarters, I was actually working on acquisitions and plans. So I traveled a lot to the US to work on the F-15 project as well in St. Louis. And Drew mentioned in my in his introduction of me that just 4 years ago I also attended the Air Command and Staff College in Alabama in 2017. So all these experiences really allowed me to better understand the culture, the SOPs, the way the US military thinks. And at the same time, it allowed me to share my culture as well, and also how Singapore military works. And I think through all these experiences, as we grow up in our career, as we have various touch points, that's where we really build the interoperability And when it really comes to operations, like the C-130 example that Ray gave just now, it's so seamless. We may not have met before, but because of everyone's shared experiences, it becomes very mutually beneficial. The mutual understanding is there, and I think it's a testament of the strong people-to-people relations that we've built over the years.
Thank you.
I think Sebastian pretty much covered it all, but it really is. It's institutionalized in both our services, and it's hard to find someone within the U.S. Navy who hasn't at least been to Singapore. And then it may not be on a bilateral level, but it's or exercise, but stopping in for port calls. And so getting to understand that culture, and I think through the training processes, the fact that we do so many training exchanges, the tactics, techniques, and procedures from both our services are so similar that it really is seamless. And the only thing you have to do over the radio is understand someone with an accent that's a little different. And it's something we know, okay, use the same words, same terminology. And so when we come together at sea or in the air, it's something that it's automatic. And it really is a testament to the investments we've made over the past 30, 40 years, really, with, I think, our Army exercises starting initially. But that investment has paid off in this interoperability.
Thank you, Ray. Before I get to the next question, I just want to remind everybody online to please, if you want to ask any questions, this is a wonderful opportunity. Please feel free to use the comment function and ask any question, and we'll pose it to our guests. Nicholas, let me ask you a question. I very much appreciate that you point out that this relationship is about much more than just defense, and that U.S. is the largest foreign direct investor here, first FTA signed by the U.S. in an Asian country, and Sebastian and Ray just pointed out that over the last 3 weeks, they've had essentially the most important military officials, cabinet members coming to Singapore. Yet there is a recurring concern here, and it's reflected sometimes in articles and certainly in discussions in think tanks and here at the school about the U.S. not paying enough attention to Southeast Asia. Could you give me your sense, why do you think that's such a persistent narrative when clearly the relationship isn't just about high-level visits? I mean, it starts out in Ray's case as a plebe at the Naval Academy. But why is it there's this either concern or just recurring narrative that the U.S. is simply absent?
That's a fascinating issue, and I mean, it's something that we have spoken about in the past, two of us as well. And I think one of the challenges, of course, can come from the nature of how Southeast Asia, and in a more sort of institutionalized grouping like ASEAN, has positioned itself. I think we're all quite familiar that one of the key tenets of ASEAN is neutrality. We champion very much the centrality of ASEAN itself. We champion the concept of non-intervention in each other's affairs. So it's a fairly benign grouping. It's hard to put a finger on what ASEAN actually is. It's a bunch of countries that don't share a lot of commonality in terms of development, in terms of political systems, in terms of history. They don't hardly share land borders, with a few exceptions. And it's spread geographically over a very disparate area. So for the US to think about engaging with ASEAN, and I'm not speaking on behalf of America, but if I were to imagine it, it's a grouping that, not to put too fine a point in it, doesn't seem to be able to do very much collectively. There's a lot of benefit to engage in different countries for different reasons. I think the US has, we've talked a lot about the military relationships with Singapore, but there are very strong relationships with other countries in the region as well for a variety of reasons and in a variety of different ways, given the differences in the military forces of individual countries. So if we want to say, why is the US not, I sort of raised the point that SecDef Austin was the first cabinet member to come to Southeast Asia. It's well known that Secretary Blinken didn't come to Southeast Asia when he came to Asia. He spent a bit of time in North Asia and then to South Asia and sort of flying over, those of us here in the region. So it was very welcome to see the SecDef come here. But at the same time, the question is, what would the US get from investing a lot of time and energy, strategically in this particular region, compared to the rest of the world? This is not to say that there's no investment and there's no relationships. It's just that there would be other priorities, the Quad, for example. And if we compared the potential outcomes from engaging with the Quad versus engagement with ASEAN, it's not hard to see from a US perspective why, in terms of priorities, there might be a slight difference in that sense. But I think, as we've seen with the high-level visits, with the SecDef being here in Singapore and then moving on to other parts of Southeast Asia, it's definitely not a question of whether Southeast Asia is a priority or not. It certainly is in this part of the world. It's just potentially a question of where does it fall in terms of things to do. So, it's heartening to see things happening. In terms of a wish list, I think, obviously we in Southeast Asia, as being Southeast Asians, would of course like to see a more engagement. In Singapore, I mentioned briefly, we haven't had an ambassador since 2016. The Chargé d'Affaires, Stephanie before Rafiq, have done a fantastic job. But it is a signal if there was an ambassador. And from what we hear, it is again on the list of things to do for the Biden administration and the State Department. So we certainly look forward to that. And I think going forward, Singapore, as a case in point, given that we are talking about US SG 55, will continue to try to play a role to anchor a bit of a US presence in this region, whether it's through the Shangri-La Dialogue or the various other high-level engagements that we have, and all the way down to the exercises that we've discussed. We'll continue to engage and encourage the US to remain invested here. And of course, more the merrier, the greater level of focus. I think the more all countries in the region stand to benefit.
Thank you, Nicholas. Let me pose another question, and I'll do the same and pose it to both Ray and Sebastian. Maybe could you give us a sense of multilateral engagement in the region where Singapore is involved? I mean, for me, it's very easy to think about Singapore participating in multilateral exercises that the U.S. organizes, like RIMPAC, for example. But are there examples or opportunities where the U.S. and Singapore cooperate with third countries within Southeast Asia, like the Philippines or Malaysia, to deal with some of these common interests? And then maybe if you could identify what are those common interests. I mean, gray zone conflicts can be quite broad. Clearly, there's a lot of cooperation going on. The Changi Information Fusion Center looking at fisheries and I don't mean to answer your question for you, but are there opportunities to expand the bilateral relationship and have an impact regionally?
You want to go first?
Well, I did in my opening remarks mention the Information Fusion Center, which I think has really provided a model for regional cooperation. And it's a very broad grouping that incorporates many countries, over 20, I know. Sebastian may have the exact number. But it also, not just countries, I think it also establishes networks beyond just the Fusion Center here. And so this is one, I was previously in India, and they established the Information Fusion Center Indian Ocean region, and then establishing linkages there. And then you've got other ASEAN countries. So in Thailand, there's the ThaiMech. Brunei has a fusion center. So establishing these linkages to address shared threats in the maritime domain. And I think that's something that it's not just about the monitoring of the information that comes in about white shipping or merchant traffic, but it's also about upholding the international rules-based order and being able to foster an understanding of concerns amongst those liaisons who are there. And I think that almost the value of these fusion centers is not represented by the actual outputs, the products that come out of there, but it's enabling those connections between the liaisons who are present, and then being able to share concerns with them. And then they all report back to their national headquarters. And so this is something where these investments have really fostered cooperation in the region. And using that model, moving on to the Counterterrorism Information Facility, which just stood up in December of 2020. And this is something the U.S. Partnered with Singapore to support. And we're very proud of our contribution, and we have high hopes that this is going to address a threat that is ongoing and continues in the region, and concerns about returning foreign fighters, and this particularly for Singapore, given the close proximity to different areas and a lack of much depth where the threats can come quickly, and with the sea routes and immediately around Singapore, it's something trying to understand and work with neighboring countries to understand any threats and share information. So if Singapore has some information and being able to share it with its partners, if the US has information, we can share it amongst that group. And then I also mentioned this ADMM Cyber and Information Center of Excellence. While that does not include the US, but this is a concern for all of us. The cyber threat is real, it's growing, and it's something that we should find ways to partner better with our partners in the region, and Singapore is making a leading effort for that. And we also are looking to expand our bilateral relationship on cyber with Singapore as well.
Okay, on my side, I'll highlight 3 key points, and I think, mainly about the ASEAN Defense Minister meeting mechanism. And I would say, looking back over the past few years and decade since the ADMM Plus was established, we have done very well. So the first point is we have secured, for ADMM Plus meetings twice a year, we have secured the top level of representation, which really shows the commitment by the leaders of ADMM, of ASEAN countries, of the Plus countries, in terms of their commitment to the region. Most recently, in June, because of the COVID situation, the meeting was held virtually, but I thought it's notable that Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, he actually attended it as well. So I think it shows, first point is that it shows very high level commitment to the ASEAN regional security architecture. And the second point is we beyond just conversations, we do actually have exercises to build interoperability, mutual understanding as well. And just a few years ago, we have an ASEAN-US maritime exercise. So, and that was quite big, because we had many countries coming together and actually exercising together. I think the third point I want to bring up would be in terms of furthering, where else can we continue to engage between US and ASEAN countries. We have this ADMM Plus experts working group, whereby it is split into various groups of common interests like HADR, maritime security, CBR, and basically the Plus countries will team up with one of the ASEAN countries, and basically we'll hold expert working group whereby people can just share, discuss, and also to really build up the competency and also the understanding on these issues of mutual interest. So I think we have a good mechanism on the ASEAN track with the US and with the other Plus countries, whereby we can strengthen the regional security architecture. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Dawn, let me turn back to you and the law enforcement cooperation. Again, I mean, things like ADMM Plus meetings, get a lot of attention. You've got a lot of high-level officials, but something you mentioned earlier, I thought I could draw you out a bit more on, was wildlife trafficking. Yes. Something I don't normally think about much is sort of key to U.S.-Singapore cooperation, but why is it key to U.S.-Singapore cooperation would be my question.
So a little known fact is that 25% of the world's wildlife is trafficked through Southeast Asia, and that includes timber. And Singapore being a large transshipment port, obviously the bulk of it is coming through Singapore. And so I would just like to highlight our relationship with NParks and Singapore Customs. I think it's key. Starting in 2018, we collaborated with our office in Ho Chi Minh City, and Singapore was able to seize 3,500 kilograms of ivory. Again, in 2019, we were able to seize 9 tons of ivory coming through. And so these are sometimes terrorist organizations that are using wildlife, taking the proceeds to fund their illicit activities. And so through NParks, we were able to send samples of this ivory to Dr. Wasser, who works at the University of Washington, and he's doing DNA sampling. And so through the DNA sampling, they're going to be able to determine where this ivory came from, and it'll help us target those transnational criminal organizations. And then through our relationships in the financial sector, we're able to trace those illicit funds to go after these organizations. And typically organizations who are trafficking wildlife are also trafficking narcotics and people. And so overall, it gives us a really big picture. So because of Singapore's transit, port, it's a key relationship for us, and the fact that they recognize that this is an important global problem, and the implications related to transnational organized crime, it's key.
So, I mean, is it linked to terrorism as well?
I can't say for sure, but I would say that when we look at the subsets of criminal organizations, we see that terrorist funding can be linked to multiple crime sets, right? And so it can be narcotics, it could be human trafficking, it could be a broad brush. And so we take wildlife trafficking seriously. Obviously, we're depleting our natural resources, but in addition, we have to look at that illicit funding, and that's really where the key is, right, is looking at the illicit funding. And being here in Singapore is key with the financial hub that Singapore is, and the cooperation that we get from our partners in the private sector.
Fantastic, thank you. That's very insightful. Let me turn to another topic. We haven't got any questions coming in from the audience, so I'll keep fielding them. We've mentioned cyber a number of times, and most people don't necessarily know much about cyber. I mean, we know about hacks, we know about state actors, we know about crime, but maybe I could ask each of you to take a quick turn and give us a sense of where you think the key challenges lie, and then where are the opportunities for U.S.-Singapore cooperation. And maybe Sebastian, if I start with you, kind of what's Singapore's interest in the cyber defense? I mean, cyber crime is what, if that's something you're comfortable talking about, yeah. or cyber defense more from a protecting of government networks standpoint.
I think for many countries as well, we've seen an increase in cyber attacks. Singapore is not spared as well. A lot of our commercial companies and also government entities like SingHealth has experienced hacks. So I think the key thing is really, from a military point of view, is really cyber defense, and really working with partners who are quite advanced in their capabilities, and really to share experiences, to share technology, to see how best can we tackle these cyber threats. And cyber threats are not so simple because of attributability, is it state, non-state, and it goes into all this gray zone. So it's a growing area, it's a nascent area, and something that I think all militaries will need to spend more resources to try to improve on.
And if
I wanted to just jump in, on the issue of cyber. In I think 2015, 2016, when Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong called on President Obama towards the end of his term in office, one of the key agreements that was signed pertained to cyber collaboration between Singapore and the US. And I think it was newsworthy at that time because this is an area that major powers like the US don't ink official collaborations every day. It has to be with a trusted partner. And I think one of the reasons why is because in the cyberspace, as exactly what Sebastian sort of covered, it is essentially gray. There are the ability to identify and attribute attacks and threats to a certain extent. You never really know who potentially might be your friend one day and your enemy the next. So for that collaboration to have been inked as far back as 2016 was certainly very significant. I think if we look to future threats, Cyber is sort of a big catch-all, but if I were to position it in an even bigger sort of umbrella, anything within the tech sphere and threats from technology, whether it's AI, whether it's robotics, whether it's cyber, whether it's in the realm of information operations, social media networks, becoming a challenge for countries all around the world. It is extremely fast-moving and fast-evolving because of the definition of the technological developments that are driving these threats. And then, as I sort of alluded to, the grayness of this threat means it's really hard to identify who's your friend one day and who might not be your friend the next day. So if I were to talk about that, I mean, one example would be cryptocurrency. It's a fairly new, and we've been talking about it for a few years, but still fairly new in terms of global presence and adoption. I think authorities all around the world are grappling a little bit with regulation, compliance, and standardization. One of the big threats is money laundering and terrorism financing through the use of cryptocurrency. So if we talk about potential for more collaboration in different areas, this is certainly one area. Cyber for sure, but technology on a broader front. A lot of scope for deeper collaboration between countries like the US and Singapore.
And if I may just add on the law enforcement sector, so U.S. law enforcement agencies collaborate and do training regularly with Singapore law enforcement agencies on cryptocurrency, on digital currency, to help share common goals, right? Because I think we don't really understand how it all works sometimes. We have the dark net, and so if you don't have that bilateral cooperation, you're going to be left in the dark. So it's key for that collaborative effort and the information sharing.
And trust becomes critical because
absolutely.
My friends in cyber used to tell me, when we sign up with partnerships with people, you never really know how deep that partnership is going to be, because it may not be an attack from somebody that you thought was a partner, but if somebody has capabilities and identifies a potential threat to another country, they may choose to alert the other country or not, because in a very sort of practical sense, identifying the threat and monitoring how it evolves may give the other country then some ideas of potential tactics and strategies as well. And it's hard to hold a partner to task for not telling you about a threat, because you wouldn't know whether they saw it or not. So it is an area that is very murky, and I think having these official agreements and MOUs signed between the Singapore and the US go a long way to establishing a partnership that we can build on for sure for the future.
Great. Did you have a thought?
Unfortunately, Sebastian and I think, can really echo each other's thoughts. So he stole all my points. But regarding Nick's point on President Obama, the agreement signed 4 or 5 years ago, it really is, cyber is a whole government effort. And so it's something across all our agencies. We really have multiple lines of effort that all need to collaborate together in the interagency, and so that's something we do at the embassy. But my responsibility is on the defense side, and so as Sebastian mentioned, we perceive have a similar threat perception to Singapore, that there are cyber actors who are looking to intrude our networks, and this is something. There are opportunities for cooperation, and as we evolve, both of us evolve our forces into more digital forces, it's going to be an area where there's going to be an imperative to cooperate, and I do foresee that as an area that we will proceed forward.
Thank you. That's very insightful. So we still have a few more minutes. I'll ask one more question, and then we'll save a little bit of time at the end for everyone to make some final thoughts or observations that maybe we didn't get to in the Q&A. But Nicholas, you said something that struck me, and again, I'll pose the question to everybody. But the way you described essentially the high-level interactions and agreements, and Sebastian, you very much emphasized, it's these MOUs that really form the basis for the relationship, and then the execution that follows is very close. So maybe from each of you, we've talked a little bit about kind of the future and what we could do, but where would you think the future would be and where do you think we'd be best served by having maybe new MOUs or agreements, or the areas where you think senior level leadership on both sides could be focusing on that's not getting enough attention? So basically, what would your policy recommendations be to areas that you think are maybe underappreciated or under-resourced?
Maybe I'll take a stab first. I was quite inspired by SecDef Austin's speech at the Fullerton lecture a couple of days ago. And he mentioned a couple of times in his speech the concept of building back better, which is obviously a huge platform for the Biden administration. I think as we talk a lot about the COVID situation, we were talking with a high level of optimism that we might return to some normalcy this year. Doesn't look like it's going to happen. The more pessimistic among us will say maybe not even in 2022. But this notion of building back better is critical, and it's critical for a country like Singapore for a number of reasons. In Singapore, we never let a crisis go to waste. So in a certain sense, it's always thinking about what does current crises teach us about vulnerabilities and challenges and risks, and what can we do to, in a sense, emerge ahead of the curve once the curve sort of normalizes. And that's an area that we're constantly thinking about economically, geostrategically, and even to a certain extent in the sense of sustainability. I think this is one area where the US and Singapore is very aligned in the sense that as we build back hopefully better, we want to look at activities, economic operations, and indeed all facets of our day-to-day lives that are not only better for, in terms of maybe economic and financial terms, but it's better for the environment, better for future generations, and creates a more sustainable world. So if I had to look a little bit into the future, I think this notion of building back better is great, but how do we build back better together? How do we then share, and again, I'm stealing lines from Secretary Austin's speech, but how do we share best practices, new ideas? How do we jointly collaborate to build technologies or processes that are better for the environment and better for the world as a whole? And I think that collaboration will deepen not just the here and now and what we're doing today, not just what we're doing in a defense and security posture, but it's a more holistic kind of collaboration. Drew, you mentioned that we have all these MOUs, so I think it's also a question of stringing it all together and asking ourselves, do all these agreements from trade to defense, security, people-to-people ties, education, in terms of technology and fighting crime, how do they help us to come out of this crisis in a better position than where we were before we went into that? Which was already a strong position, but being as we are at US SG 55 is a good time to say, we'll carry on doing all the good stuff. How does it become even better for the future?
Maybe I'll go next.
Please.
I'll highlight once again 3 points. I like using 3 points. So as I look to the future, I thought it was a very good question because it's something that I haven't really thought about, Drew. So really during the time that Nick was speaking, it gave me some time to collect my thoughts. So I think the first one is related to what Nick is saying, but I'll say to me the first point would be pandemic resilience. We've seen how COVID-19 is really going to be an endemic disease, and it's here to stay. And how can we have seen a significant disruption to defense diplomacy, outgoing visits, incoming visits, exercises, collaboration, everything had to go to virtual as well. So how do we collaborate to come back to some form of normalcy? And at the same time, as the variants of the disease start to evolve, who knows, it may really evolve to something more deadly. So we should capitalize on a good crisis, and how can we work together to really build up the pandemic resilience. I think the second point that I'll say is climate change. This is a very hot topic as well, and my Minister of Defense spoke quite a lot about it this year during the Committee of Supply Debate, and it's something, and Prime Minister spoke about it last year as well. So it is really something that we all militaries, I think all companies, commercial companies as well, will need to think very closely, and we should start to return the effects of climate change. The last one, I'll say emerging technology, similar to what Nick spoke about, but I will really drill down to if I have to pick one, I'll say artificial intelligence. It's a nascent, growing area. There isn't norms for the responsible use of AI. There are conversations that are starting among militaries and countries. So I think these are areas that we can work together, not just between Singapore and US, but I think these are conversations that we need to have globally as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in for a second, if that's okay, Ray?
Please.
I think when you mention AI, I think not only in the defense sector, but I think when we talk about intellectual property, right? And that's key in the region. And AI is becoming a real problem for all companies. And I think it's how do we engage the private sector and the public sector to build a more robust enforcement effort to protect companies, which in the end protect our governments and our financial infrastructure. And so I think that's a huge gap that needs to be addressed. And I think that those conversations need to be discussed with like-minded countries globally, right? Not just Singapore and the United States, but I think we have to engage our trusted partners to really attack this problem set, because it's going to come, it's getting ahead of us is what I think, and it really is a problem.
Right, and I guess the way I would think of it is, what would our objective be, vice saying what MOUs are there? So as I look at it, how do we identify our shared interests between our countries, and then what activities could we conduct to ensure that we're securing our shared interests? And there's certain things that we don't have the perfect alignment of interest, or we may be constrained where we can't take certain things forward, and we have to accept that reality. And however, there's a lot of areas where we perhaps haven't reached our full potential. So we've talked about some of them already, that we're moving along in the right direction and we can advance in those areas. But one area I think that is posing a threat to all of our interests is just activities below the threshold of armed conflict. So we've identified the gray zone. So this isn't just our bilateral shared interest, but it's threats to the international rules-based order. And so what activities can we conduct? How can we share information? How can we share information multilaterally? How can we identify threats to the international rules-based order? And not just talking about state actors, it's non-state actors, it's climate, it's pandemic, it's across the board. And then finding ways, what tools can we apply? And in certain cases, those could be military tools. In other cases, it's law enforcement or economic development, economic cooperation, and finding partners who are aligned to really advance those shared interests and advance and preserve the international rules-based order.
We've gotten a couple of good questions online that have just been fed to the iPad here about COVID-19 and capturing a bunch of the sentiments. Sebastian, you just mentioned it but something that you basically have to deal with in order to conduct business as usual. Is there an opportunity for the US and Singapore and the military specifically, or more broadly, to cooperate on pandemic response in other countries in the region?
That's a very difficult question, I think, because in many cases that is a sovereign response. And then as you look at, there are logistics capabilities that militaries can bring to bear, but in many cases vaccinations, it's something that national carriers are typically the means where it's carried, and it's not a very large shipment. But I think if you look at what Singapore's recently done with Indonesia and India, transporting over oxygen cylinders. So these are things in finding what is required and where are the countries asking, and then how to bring it over. So on the logistics side, that's something that obviously the military has a very good logistics capability. I also think as we just talk about our individual forces on COVID impacts readiness, and if we share best practices on how to ensure that you're able to conduct an activity. We just saw yesterday, or the past few days, the International Maritime Security Conference that the Republic of Singapore Navy hosted, where our Chief of Naval Operations, and and finding protocols that enable a safe environment to conduct these activities. And then on board ships, aircraft, we all have lessons learned to apply to ensure that we can ensure the readiness of our forces. But I do think we're still trying to find ways that the military element of national power can contribute to the whole government effort. If you look at the United States recently, the efforts by the administration really to advance vaccines, bringing vaccines to the region, donating them around the region, has been extremely well received, I believe, but it's not necessarily something that the military really needs to contribute to.
Yeah, I'll echo what Ray said. I think we play more of a supporting role. Really the good thing about the militaries are that we are generally more responsive, or rather more flexible, and you can activate resources immediately if, let's say, there are, you know, that the situation in various countries are not doing too well. You can just activate military resources to deliver aid, to deliver COVID vaccines, to deliver oxygen tanks, which Singapore have been doing over the past few months for India, Indonesia. So I think that's so far really the utility of the military to help to expeditiously distribute aid and assistance when needed.
I just had one side point to make. You know, beyond the practical on-ground benefits of extension of aid, I think the efforts that Singapore has been doing to help partners in the region, and I don't want to preempt my closing remarks, but I was going to talk about deepening understanding of one another. And I think that if you look at today's news, that Singapore had extended some aid to Myanmar, and I think it has been highlighted that, you know, and our Prime Minister and our Foreign Minister have been very critical of what's the situation politically that's been happening in Myanmar, especially with regards to the civilians. And I think that this reflects the ASEAN way. It's okay to be critical, but when people need help, we're always there for one another. And I think that, you know, our Prime Minister has also cautioned against demanding for sanctions to be imposed on Myanmar as a direct reaction to what's happening politically. You know, and the ASEAN way has always been about drawing people in, engaging in building community, and then effecting positive change through that way. So I think as a case in point, the fact that Singapore is extending aid as much as it can to Myanmar in this critical time is a reflection of the way that Singapore, and to a certain extent ASEAN, views relationships within Southeast Asia. And you know, ostensibly it's a useful, you know, case in point and a very practical example of how Singapore views things. And having that better understanding would potentially help ties between Singapore and the US in the future, for sure.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time. I want to give everyone a chance to raise any last points that they may have been holding in reserve or haven't been asked yet. One of the questions asked something broad that I thought I could convey. It said basically, what do you think are the most important security issues that the Southeast Asian region will face in the next 10 years? And how can the US and Singapore work together to tackle these issues? So it's a very broad question, but maybe a way that you could frame your final remarks before we sign off. Do you want to work in reverse order, Nicholas, if you still have some thoughts?
We could do that. In terms, maybe just very quickly on that question, in terms of security threats going forward, I think we've covered that quite at length. It's probably cyber. I spent a lot of time looking at information threats, and I think, you know, how that spills into the social media space and in terms of manipulation of information and fake news. I think that will continue to be a threat with us for a long time. And of course, the pandemic and in a broader sense, sustainability and climate change will be common threats that all of us have to figure out ways to work together on. And I think we've explored that quite a lot. Look still in the vein of looking towards the future and drawing on what I think just about all of us have touched on. People-to-people ties, I think, is critical in terms of building a stronger and more fruitful relationship. Deepening the understanding doesn't necessarily start at the MOU level. It starts at the people-to-people level and then flows throughout the system. And I think the experiences of both Ray and Sebastian in their time, you know, and coming across, you know, counterparts from different countries has been great to hear. And I think it certainly has shaped the appreciation of at least those of us in the room of how this relationship can be improved. I just wanted to highlight in a more timely fashion that, and Drew, since you mentioned the Olympics at the start, our defending Olympic champion, Joseph Schooling, is going to be swimming in a few minutes' time. It's worthwhile noting that he spent bulk of his training in the US, benefiting from the infrastructure there, the very strong competition. And many of our athletes have benefited from studying and training in the States, among other countries. And hopefully those kind of ties continue to broaden and deepen. I noticed that Ray has also spoken about his indoctrination into Singapore culture. One thing you didn't mention is durian.
Yes, I have acquired a taste.
That is a critical benchmark. I noticed that you didn't mention it explicitly, so just wanted to be
sure.
It took
3 times, I think. That's my rule. So, but yes.
And I think that those kind of ties is great to see, and here's to 55 more good years of that strong relationship.
Thank you, Nicholas. Ray, any last thoughts?
Pertaining to the question you brought up, I've mentioned it many times, but I think really just preservation of the international rules-based order. And this is something that Singapore and the United States, it's at the foundation of our defense cooperation. And identifying threats to that and then working together to counter them is going to be something that's going to be facing us over the coming years, and as what could be in the cyber domain, it can be in all domains, and including the gray zone. And just one other point I'd like to highlight is that our cooperation is long-standing. It's not new. We've had announcements over the years of bringing in P8s or the LCS, but if you look back before that, I mean, as you mentioned, Nick, the foundation has already been established, and then we're really just identifying what we're already doing almost when we sign these MOUs or make these announcements. And I just foresee continued growth. We're on a great trajectory right now, and so I think the strengthening of the relationship will just continue.
Great. Sebastian?
I think with regard to your question, I agree with what Nick and Ray has mentioned. I'll add another point would be, I think for me it would be terrorism. It is an existential threat for us. We have episodes over the last few years that fortunately were void. I think moving forward, we must continue to remain vigilant. We cannot let our guard down, and COVID-19, with returning fighters from Middle East, COVID-19, these are distractions that can allow terrorism to continue to fester. So with that, for my closing remarks, I think we had a very fruitful discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversations, and thank you very much, Drew, for this invitation. And thank you.
Thank you. Dawn, last thought?
Yes, I would just say that I think that our continued relationship is key for national security and economic security, and we look forward to continuing our partnership with our colleagues in Singapore law enforcement. And I want to thank you all today for including law enforcement in the security piece. I think it is a key point, but of course it's near and dear to my heart. And I think there's definitely ways that law enforcement and the military can intersect, especially in the cybersecurity space. So I look forward to seeing what the possibilities are in the future. Thank you for having me, and here's to another 55 years.
Thank you. I want to thank each of the panelists for joining us this evening. I think this has been a very, very fruitful, very insightful conversation with real practitioners and experts and managers of the U.S.-Singapore relationship. So thank you very much for joining us. And I'd like to thank all of the viewers online on Facebook for submitting their questions and for participating as well. Please be sure to join us. The next installment of this series will be on August 26th, where a distinguished panel will discuss U.S.-Singapore economic relations. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good evening.